Get out, millionaire CEO shouted, and not knowing she pregnant with his triplets. Until 5 years later, I'm your storyteller, James. Hope you're doing well today. How many of my loyal viewers are still with me? Drop your city or country in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Today's story is one you can't miss, emotional, powerful, and full of love, pain, and healing. So grab a seat, don't skip a second, and if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel. It means the world to me. Let's dive into the story. The sound of thunder rolled through the night sky like the growl of a wounded beast, echoing through the grand marble halls of the Blackwood mansion, shaking the foundation just as violently as the moment that had split her world apart. Alina Moore stood trembling in the vast entryway, her soaked clothes clinging to her soft skin like a second punishment. Her long, dark hair dripping water onto the polished floors that used to feel like home beneath her bare feet. Her fingers shook as she reached out toward him, her lips trembling with words she couldn't form, because no amount of pleading could be heard over the storm of his wrath that raged louder than the weather outside. Damian Blackwood stood across the room like a statue carved from cold steel and betrayal, his piercing gray eyes dull with fury, jaw clenched so tightly that his face had turned stone-like, as if showing emotion would be a sign of weakness he couldn't afford. "Get out!" he shouted, voice slicing through the silence like a whip, laced with pain, mistrust, and an irreversible finality that shattered her world like a mirror crashing from the highest tower. Alina gasped softly, her hands falling to her sides as if the life had drained out of her limbs, as if his words had struck her in the chest with the force of a falling sky. She wanted to speak, to beg him to listen, to at least look at her, really look at her. But Damien's eyes no longer saw the woman who had loved him with every fragile fiber of her being. They only saw a lie he believed to be the truth. She took a step forward, the wet slap of her bare foot on the marble floor sounding louder than it should have, and with each inch she closed, she silently prayed he'd pull her into his arms like he used to, with the fire in his eyes turning to warmth, with the love in his soul reaching out through the storm. But that warmth never came. That fire remained ice. That love, if it had ever truly existed, was buried beneath the weight of whatever he'd been told, whatever he'd seen, whatever he'd chosen to believe without giving her the chance to explain. Her lips finally parted, trembling as she whispered, "Damien, please." But even that simple plea was met with the cold, merciless slamming of his hand against the wooden door behind her, flung open to reveal the torrential downpour outside, wind howling in like a ghost, come to collect what remained of her dignity. She looked back at him one last time, searching for the man she had once loved, the man who used to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear when she cried, the man who used to lift her chin and say, "You are mine, and I protect what's mine." But that man was gone, replaced by a figure she didn't recognize. He stood tall, proud, arrogant, and broken in a way she couldn't fix. His lips twisted in something cruel, a mask of strength that barely hid his own hurt. He thought she had betrayed him. He thought she had destroyed the trust between them. And he didn't care to hear her side, to ask a single question, to give her even a sliver of the grace she had given him time and time again. Alina took a shaky step backward, the rain immediately soaking her even more as she passed the threshold, the doorframe acting as a gateway between the life she once knew and the unknown that now stretched out before her like a chasm. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, echoing the sound of the storm as she descended the mansion steps barefoot, each footfall cutting into the cold stone beneath her. But no physical pain could compare to the ache swelling inside her ribcage. Damien watched her go, his silhouette still framed in the light from the mansion's foyer, and for one brief second, just one, the mask slipped and something flickered in his eyes. But if it was regret, it came too late. If it was love, it was buried too deep. And if it was doubt, it wasn't enough to stop him from slowly, deliberately, slamming the door shut. The sound of that door closing felt like the world ending. Alina stumbled into the night, rain cascading over her skin, mixing with her tears as they fell silently down her cheeks. Her dress clung to her body like a shroud, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth she would never find. Every raindrop that hit her face felt like an echo of his voice, a repetition of the words she couldn't stop hearing. Get out. The man she had loved more than life itself had turned his back on her without hesitation, and she didn't know how to breathe anymore. She kept walking, aimless, heartbroken, devastated in a way words could never contain. Each step took her further from the mansion, from Damien, from the dream she had built in her heart for years. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. What lie had been told? What proof had been shown? Who had done this to her? And why? She would never know because he never let her speak. He never gave her a chance to defend herself. In his eyes, she was guilty, sentenced, and exiled in a single breath. That hurt more than anything. Not the betrayal he believed. Not even the loss of home or wealth or security. What shattered her to the core was how easily he had chosen to believe the worst of her, without question, without love. Her shoes had been left behind, her phone, her pride, everything. She wandered into the darkness of the night, her heart echoing the storm that raged above her, sobs racking her chest as she walked through puddles, gravel, mud. The rain blurred her vision, but it didn't matter. Her world had already blurred the moment he stopped seeing her for who she truly was. She wanted to scream, to collapse, to disappear. But something inside her, something raw and wounded and fiercely maternal, whispered a quiet strength. She didn't know she was already carrying 3 lives inside her. She didn't know the universe had already written a different ending for her. But in that moment, beneath the howl of the wind and the relentless weight of the downpour, she promised herself one thing: she would never return. Not unless he came for her, not unless he knew the truth, not unless he learned how much he had destroyed. Back in the mansion, Damien stood alone in the entryway, the rain muffled now by the thick walls of his estate, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the grand piano beside him. His heart was a battlefield, rage, pain, and something else fighting for dominance. The lie he had been shown played over and over in his mind, and each time he remembered it, the pain grew sharper. He had seen her with another man, laughter, touch, closeness, photographs that had appeared on his desk like poison. Words had been whispered into his ear by people he thought loyal, people who said she was playing him, that she had never loved him, and like a fool he believed them. But why? Why did he believe them so quickly? Because Damien Blackwood didn't know how to handle vulnerability. Because love to him was always conditional, something that could be broken, stolen, manipulated. And when he thought she had betrayed him, he responded not with pain, but with anger. Anger was easier. Anger kept him from collapsing. But now, as he stood alone in the silence of a house that suddenly felt too big, too empty, too cold, he realized something terrifying. She hadn't fought him. She hadn't begged. She had looked at him one last time, and in her eyes was a heartbreak deeper than words. A heartbreak that whispered truth louder than any evidence. And he had ignored it. The clock struck midnight. The rain continued to fall. And far, far away, a woman with a broken heart and a womb unknowingly carrying 3 pieces of his soul curled up beneath a stranger's awning and cried herself to sleep. The morning after leaving Damien's mansion, Alina sat curled up on a stranger's bench at a quiet bus stop, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin as the cold wind whipped around her fragile frame. Her lips trembled not from the chill, but from the echo of Damien's voice still clawing at her ears. Get out! She hadn't slept, her shoes were still gone, and her dignity had been trampled the moment he chose to believe a lie over her love. But even as her soul wept, her body ached in unfamiliar ways. A strange dizziness washed over her as she leaned her head against the metal post, breathing heavily and gripping her stomach as a sharp nausea surged without warning. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was something deeper, something physical, like her body crying out from within. Her fingers twitched as the thought crept into her heart, wild and impossible, but too persistent to ignore. A few hours later, she rented a single room in a tiny, run-down inn on the outskirts of town, her hands still trembling as she used the last of her money to buy warm food and a small bag of essentials. The room smelled like mildew, the curtains were torn, and the heater groaned with age. But it was shelter. and for now it was all she had. As night fell, her chest tightened again with that same dizzying wave, and her body shivered with something beyond the cold. The suspicion she had earlier in the day returned, stronger and more insistent. Her cycle had been off. Her body felt alien. Her heart raced as she tore through her purse, fingers fumbling for coins, enough to buy a single pregnancy test from the tiny 24/7 pharmacy 3 blocks away. She walked through the night fog in silence, her arms crossed over her chest, every step echoing with the truth she wasn't ready to accept. The cashier didn't speak when she paid. He just offered a sympathetic look as he handed her the small plastic bag. Alina avoided his eyes. She returned to her room, bolting the door, and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the little box in her hands like it was a bomb. Time crawled. Her breaths came shallow. And finally, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, she entered the tiny bathroom and followed the instructions in silence. She set the test on the sink. 1 minute passed, then another, then 5. Her heart beat so loudly she thought it would deafen her. When she turned it over, her soul cracked open. 2 pink lines, clear, bold, undeniable. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there on the cold floor, her back against the wall, staring into space while her hand hovered over her flat belly. Pregnant, with Damien's baby. No babies. Somehow, something inside her told her there was more than one heartbeat growing. Maybe a mother's instinct. Maybe divine irony. She closed her eyes as Damien's furious face replayed in her memory, the way he shouted without listening, the way he threw her love away like garbage. And now pieces of him were growing inside her, life forming from the ashes of rejection. She grabbed her phone, thumb hovering over his contact, praying that just maybe, he'd answer. The first call went straight to voicemail. The second, too. By the 10th, the number was blocked. She tried texting. Nothing delivered. She emailed. No reply. She even found the number of his personal assistant, who politely told her Mr. Blackwood was not available and to refrain from calling again. Alina's heart broke all over again. She didn't want money. She didn't want pity. She just wanted him to know. But he didn't. He wouldn't. And so Alina packed what little she had and left the city behind. She changed her name to Alina Rivers, choosing a quiet coastal town where no one knew her past, where gossip didn't spread like wildfire, and where the memory of Damien Blackwood couldn't haunt every corner. She found a job at a small bookstore cafe, where the smell of coffee and old pages kept her grounded while her belly began to grow. She rented a tiny studio apartment above the shop and began a new chapter. One without luxury, without the man she loved, but with 3 tiny heartbeats that gave her purpose. At night, when the silence grew heavy and loneliness pressed against her chest, she'd sit by the window and whisper to her unborn babies. "You'll never have to feel unwanted," she'd say softly, rubbing her belly with a love that poured from her like sunlight. "I'll love you enough for both of us." She watched as other couples passed in the streets below, some laughing, some arguing, but all of them together. And though her eyes stung with envy sometimes, she never allowed bitterness to take root. Her love for Damien hadn't died. It had simply transformed, folded into the new souls she carried. Every flutter she felt was like a reply, tiny limbs stretching beneath her ribs as if they were listening, understanding, forgiving. She spent her days working long hours, stacking books, making coffee, sweeping floors while her body changed more each week. She never told anyone about her past. People knew her as strong, sweet Alina, the quiet girl with a warm smile and tired eyes. She saved every penny, planning a future for her children, already picturing their names, their laughter, their tiny hands in hers. But at night, when the lights were off and the city slept, her pillow caught the tears she refused to cry during the day. She missed Damien. She missed the way he used to look at her like she was his entire world. She missed the sound of his laughter, the way his arms felt like home. And she ached not for herself, but for the father her children would never know. The father who never even gave her a chance to speak. The father who'd blocked her, shut her out, erased her as if her love never mattered. Still, she kept going. For them. Each month, she visited the small clinic in town for checkups, and by the fifth month, the doctor smiled gently as he moved the wand over her belly and said, "You're carrying triplets." Alina froze. Her breath caught. "Triplets," she echoed, stunned. "Yes, 3 strong little ones." The doctor chuckled warmly, unaware that his words had struck her heart like lightning. 3 babies, 3 heartbeats, 3 reasons to keep going. Her tears flowed silently, and the doctor assumed they were from joy. But only Alina knew they came from a complex mix of fear, loneliness, awe, and longing. That night she lay in bed with both hands spread across her growing belly, whispering to her babies as if they could already hear. "You're never going to feel abandoned. Never. Not like I did." She kissed her belly and smiled through her tears. "I'll make sure of it, even if I have to work day and night. Even if the world forgets me. I won't forget what matters." And though she rarely thought of Damien now without pain, she still lit a silent hope each time she passed a mirror that someday, maybe, he'd look into a child's eyes and see her smile in them. Maybe one day he'd know what he missed. Maybe not. But for now, this was her reality. She wasn't broken anymore. She was becoming something else. A mother. And love, this time, didn't need permission. The sky outside was a soft gray the morning Alina folded the last of the second-hand baby clothes into 3 tiny piles on her couch. One labeled Liam, one Ariel, and one Noah. The names still made her smile faintly, despite the exhaustion living behind her eyes. Her hands moved quickly out of habit, but her mind drifted far as her heart reminded her how far they had come, not just in miles from the city she once called home, but from the shattered girl who had walked barefoot through that storm 5 years ago. Now she stood, stronger, maybe thinner, maybe sadder, but taller in her soul, because she was a mother of 3 tiny humans who looked up to her like she hung the stars herself. She stepped over a pile of scattered building blocks and ducked her head to check on Noah, who had once again fallen asleep inside a laundry basket, cradling a broken toy truck as if it were treasure. His little face, peaceful and soft, held something too familiar. Those dark, serious brows and lashes that swept like shadows over his cheeks reminded her too much of a man she still dreamed about, but had long forbidden herself from forgiving. Liam, wild and ever fearless, was halfway up the back of the worn-out couch, pretending it was a pirate ship, while Ariel, delicate and full of feelings, sat at the coffee table stringing together cheap beads into necklaces she would later gift to their neighbors. "Mama, look!" Liam shouted, balancing on one leg like a sword-wielding explorer, eyes bright, unaware his shoes had holes and his socks were mismatched. "We're sailing to the moon." Alina forced a smile, because that's what mothers do, and nodded, clapping softly. "Just don't crash into Jupiter this time, Captain," she teased gently. Ariel giggled while Noah mumbled in his sleep. And even in the tiredness of that moment, with bills stacked behind her and an empty fridge humming in silent judgment, Alina let herself believe, just for a second, that maybe this small rented apartment with creaky floors and paper-thin walls was enough. Maybe for her children, it could be the safest palace in the world. The diner where she worked had cracked vinyl stools and a broken jukebox that only played old 80s songs. Alina took double shifts there, pouring coffee for truckers and tired locals who sometimes tipped her in loose change or leftover pie. Her manager, Lorraine, a loud but kind-hearted woman in her 50s, had taken a liking to Alina early on, admiring her resilience, though she never asked too many questions about the sadness behind her eyes. When Alina wasn't at the diner, she cleaned motel rooms across town or sometimes babysat for neighbors who knew she wouldn't say no because every dollar counted. She had become an expert at stretching one meal into 4 and sewing patches onto old coats so her babies wouldn't shiver in winter. Her hands were always raw from detergent, her back always sore, but her heart held strong because every night ended with a sleepy, "I love you, Mommy," whispered into her hair by the 3 souls she lived for. There were moments, small ones, where the weight of it all caught her off guard. Like when she opened the birthday card Ariel made with scribbled crayon hearts and a note that said, "You're the bestest mama in the world." Or when Noah, quiet as always, brought her a dandelion and simply said, "For you, Mommy," before crawling into her lap. Or when Liam, bruised and scraped from tree climbing, declared he'd become a superhero and buy her a castle someday. Those moments stitched together the holes in her heart, even when memories of a cold mansion, a slammed door, and the sound of her own name being spat like poison by Damien haunted her in the silence between lullabies. She never said his name out loud, not once in 5 years. But sometimes, when the twins slept and the world went quiet, she'd sit by the window, fingers curled around a chipped mug of tea, and stare out into the night, wondering if he ever missed her, if he ever even knew what he'd lost. Noah was the one who broke her heart the most. His eyes held, a depth too ancient for a child his age. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words pierced through her like knives carved from truth. One night, after a particularly harsh thunderstorm, she had found him curled beneath the table, covering his ears. She crouched beside him, holding his tiny frame against her chest. "I'm scared, Mama," he whispered. "It's too loud in my heart." She didn't know what he meant exactly, but she understood. He was his father's son, calm on the outside, thunder inside. And in those moments, Alina wished she could erase the past, not for herself, but for her children, so they'd never feel echoes of the pain they were born from. But she was only one woman, and the world was wide and sharp-edged. Liam made friends easily, his laugh echoing across playgrounds, fearless even when his clothes didn't match the fancy jackets of other kids. Ariel, too kind for her own good, often gave away her snacks or let other girls borrow her only doll. And Noah, he watched. He listened. He sketched pictures of trees and moons and houses with windows that looked too much like the mansion she once fled. Alina tried to keep them shielded from the cruelty of truth. She told them stories about dragons and fairies and strong mothers who saved kingdoms. She told them nothing about betrayal, nothing about the man with stormy eyes who had once held her heart like it was disposable. But still, somehow, the truth lived inside their faces, their mannerisms, their laughter. Damien's shadows danced in her living room every day, not as regrets, but as reflections. Sometimes Alina wondered what she'd say if she ever saw him again. Would she scream? Cry? Would she slap him for breaking her soul and walk away like he had once done? Or would she crumble, 5 years of pain boiling to the surface, and beg him to see them? Not for herself, but for the little hearts beating under the roof she built alone? But that moment never came. Instead, days turned into weeks, seasons changed, school forms were filled out under the name Alina Hart, and doctor visits were navigated without a father's signature. And still, she survived. Not just survived, but created a life, a family, a fragile kind of joy that didn't depend on anyone else's love. There were birthdays with candles stuck into cheap cupcakes and Christmases with hand-sewn stockings. There were sick days spent curled together on the couch, and first days of school where she cried more than they did. She taught them how to tie shoelaces, how to say please and thank you, and how to find stars even on cloudy nights. She taught them to laugh loudly, even if the world gave them reasons to cry. And though her reflection in the mirror grew more tired, more lined, and lonelier with each passing year, Alina never let it show. Because her children deserved joy. They deserved the best of her, even when all she had left were pieces. One night, as she lay awake listening to Liam's soft snore and Ariel's sleepy murmur, Noah stirred beside her, his little hand reaching for hers in the dark. "Mama," he said softly, "why don't we have a daddy like the other kids?" The question sliced through her like lightning. Her mouth opened, but no words came. After a moment, she whispered, "Some daddies don't know how to love right, baby, but you've got me, and I love you 3 times as much." He nodded silently, already drifting back to sleep. But Alina's heart didn't sleep that night. It cracked open again, quietly, beneath the weight of everything she had tried to bury. And so 5 years passed, not with ease, but with resilience. With scraped knees and bedtime stories, with thunderstorms and whispered dreams, with single candles and triple hugs, with love that burned fierce enough to survive without being returned. Alina had built a kingdom out of nothing and filled it with rainbows, even when the sky never cleared. She didn't need Damien Blackwood. But every night, as she kissed her babies goodnight, she still whispered to the universe, not a prayer for him to return, but a promise that if life ever brought them face to face again, she wouldn't kneel this time. She would stand tall with her heart full, her children behind her, and her soul unbroken. The evening had barely begun when Alina's world tilted dangerously. Noah's fever had been rising steadily all day, and now his small body trembled in her arms, cheeks flushed crimson as he whimpered softly, clutching her blouse with barely enough strength left to hold on. Panic rose like fire in her chest, fierce and paralyzing, but she forced herself to stay calm for the sake of the little boy who needed her more than anything in the world. Liam and Ariel stood silently at the door of their modest apartment, fear swimming in their innocent eyes as they watched their mother wrap their brother in blankets and rush toward the door, phone clutched tightly in her trembling hands as she called the only private hospital that would accept emergency walk-ins without upfront insurance. She had no choice, not when Noah's breathing was shallow, his skin frighteningly hot, and his usual silent observance had now turned to delirious murmurs. The cab ride felt eternal, her hands never leaving his burning forehead as she whispered desperate promises and prayers, rocking him gently, murmuring lullabies through cracked lips just to stay strong. The hospital loomed in the distance like a fortress of hope and dread, its pristine windows gleaming under the darkening sky as raindrops once again returned, cold, sharp, familiar, reminding her cruelly of the night, 5 years ago when another storm had torn her world apart. She didn't know that fate was circling closer with every heartbeat, didn't realize that within those polished marble walls stood the man she hadn't allowed herself to think about in years, the man whose blood ran through the boy in her arms, whose name still lived in the quietest corner of her soul. Nurses rushed to help her the moment she stepped into the emergency wing, and she refused to leave Noah's side, even as they took him in for tests, her voice cracking as she answered questions, listed symptoms, signed papers with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the cab ride. Across the corridor, Damian Blackwood walked with purposeful strides, phone to his ear, another business call echoing numbers and negotiations in his mind. But his eyes, sharp and trained, caught the flash of a blanket wrapped around a small boy, the profile of a nurse carrying him, and for a second, just a second, he froze. There was something haunting in the shape of that child's face, in the quiet fire behind half-closed eyelids, in the tight fists resting on a chest that rose with shallow breath. Something achingly familiar, though he couldn't place it. He dismissed it. Coincidence, surely. Another child, another case, another fleeting shadow of a thought not worth chasing. But as he passed one of the observation rooms, his steps slowed. The soft hum of a lullaby filtered through the cracked door, a tune that once lived in his memory, one he hadn't heard in years but had clung to in the darkest corners of sleep. His heart faltered, breath catching in his throat, and he turned his head slightly toward the sound, that melody digging into his chest like a memory, half remembered, like a voice that once held him together when the world threatened to fall apart. He didn't see her. The door only allowed sound and flickers of movement, a shadow sitting in the far corner, gently rocking a child's coat, whispering the lullaby in a voice lined with pain, with love, with exhaustion. He stood there for a moment, too long, brows furrowed, chest tight with something that felt too much like longing, and shook himself from it, resuming his walk down the corridor as though the past hadn't just ghosted by his shoulder. Inside the room, Alina sat beside Noah's bed, her fingers stroking his damp hair, tears slipping silently down her cheeks as machines beeped steadily in rhythm with her racing heart. She had no idea how close she'd come to facing the ghost she had buried, how near she was to the man who had once been her whole world. She kissed Noah's forehead and whispered, "You're going to be okay, baby. Mama's right here. I won't leave you," repeating it like a sacred prayer. The doctor entered with a reassuring smile, explaining the fever was high but manageable, likely a viral infection, and the IV would bring it down in a few hours. Relief poured through her in an aching flood, her muscles trembling with the release of tension, her gratitude silent but soul deep. She thanked the nurses, never noticing the name embroidered on the administrative plaque outside, Blackwood Medical Center, or the initials on the forms, too numb and focused on her son to register them. Meanwhile, Damien sat in his office, pouring himself a glass of whiskey he didn't really want, replaying the lullaby in his mind, unable to shake the strange feeling coiling in his gut. It wasn't the melody that haunted him, it was the emotion behind it, the softness, the pain wrapped in each note, the kind of sorrow only a mother could carry. And somewhere deep in the fortress of his mind, a wall cracked, letting in a sliver of doubt, of memory, of a face he had forced himself to forget. Outside, the rain fell harder, thunder rumbling in the distance like a prelude to the storm that hadn't yet passed. Alina leaned over Noah and whispered stories about stars and dragons, her voice soothing, though her own eyes stayed wide open, watching every breath he took. Her thoughts drifted to Liam and Ariel back home with the neighbor, wondering if they missed her already, wondering if they'd stayed strong like she'd taught them to be. She didn't let herself think about the hospital's name, about who might own a place like this, because she had learned to build walls, to survive behind them. But fate didn't care for walls, and destiny had already begun to thread its way between the cracks, weaving two lives closer once more. That night, while Noah slept peacefully under soft blankets and watchful machines, Damien stood on the rooftop of his hospital, staring into the storm with hands shoved into his coat pockets, that unfamiliar ache still rooted in his chest. He didn't know why he couldn't stop thinking about a child's face or a lullaby he hadn't heard in half a decade. He didn't know he'd already brushed shoulders with the woman who once shattered him and whom he had shattered in return. And Alina, exhausted and alone beside her son's bed, whispered softly to the dark ceiling, "I'll never let you be near them, Damien. Not after everything you did." Yet fate had already decided otherwise. The storm outside roared louder than before, not in farewell, but in welcome. Damien Blackwood stood near the floor-to-ceiling window of his 39th floor office, his silhouette a perfect blend of control and complication. But even the sharpest city skyline could not distract him from the strange echo left behind by a lullaby he couldn't get out of his mind, a lullaby that felt stitched to a part of him he thought was long severed, and yet it haunted him like a ghost that refused to be buried. The boardroom buzzed with high-ranking officials and a newly acquired design firm preparing to pitch their groundbreaking vision for the next Blackwood expansion project. But Damien's thoughts were still locked in that hospital corridor, where he saw a boy, dark hair, almond-shaped eyes, and a frown that mirrored his own childhood photographs. And though he shook it off that day, a sliver of suspicion had lodged itself deep, silently burning beneath his surface like coal under ice. But he didn't expect fate to thrust its blade so mercilessly into his chest. Today, not during a business deal, not in a room full of egos and tailored suits, and certainly not by resurrecting a past he thought he'd buried under success and steel. Because when she walked in, dressed in an elegant, charcoal pantsuit that hugged her curves like it was tailored by time itself, Damien's breath didn't just hitch, it imploded. Her face, untouched by time but hardened by pain, was the kind of beauty that demanded silence, and even the most arrogant executives in the room subconsciously leaned back in reverence when she stood before them, her confidence echoing louder than any words, her presence undeniable and yet heartbreakingly distant. And Damien, once a man known for never showing weakness, felt the walls of his carefully constructed world crumble in quiet terror as he mouthed a name that once tasted like hope and now bled like regret. Alina. But she turned to the board without flinching, introduced herself as Lena Moore, and laid out the design plans with a clarity and grace that made men decades older than her nod in stunned approval, while Damien sat frozen, every word she spoke slicing through his ribs like glass, because her voice, calm, measured, beautifully unreadable, carried none of the warmth he remembered, none of the laughter he used to chase in late-night kitchen moments, none of the tremble she once had when whispering his name beneath his sheets. And when the meeting adjourned, the others walked out applauding her brilliance. But Damien cornered her in the hallway like a man drowning in silence and choking on questions that came 5 years too late, gripping her arm not in anger but in disbelief. "It's you," he breathed, and her eyes, once oceans he swam freely in, were now glaciers, frozen, unmoved, unbreakable as she replied, "Was." And the word alone hit harder than any scream, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop, grabbing her wrist like a man holding on to his last breath. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you vanish? You, you were gone. And she laughed, but it was bitter, almost foreign, the sound of a woman who'd rebuilt herself, brick by brick, using pain as mortar. Tell you, you blocked every call, every message. Your guards turned me away like trash. You made it clear, Damien. You wanted me gone. So I went. And that's when it hit him. Not just the guilt, but the hollow echo of those endless voicemails he never listened to. Messages deleted in a haze of rage and betrayal. Because the truth was, the night he threw her out, he wasn't thinking. He wasn't feeling. He was just bleeding. And instead of pulling her closer, he burned everything down. And now here she was, standing in front of him like a scar-turned sculpture, exquisite and unreachable. You don't understand, he began, but she shook her head. No, you don't. You don't get to make me bleed and then ask me how I cleaned the wounds. You don't get to storm into my peace with your confusion and your broken compass. I navigated hell without you. And guess what? I made it out. My name is Lena Moore now, and I'm not your lost lover. I'm the woman who survived you. And before he could speak again, she turned, her heels clicking like a closing door, and Damien stood there, breathless, helpless, haunted, not just by her absence, but by the fact that she was now complete without him, a world he no longer belonged to. He returned to his office that day, shut the door, ignored the endless pings of business updates and congratulatory texts about the successful merger, because none of it mattered. None of it even made a dent in the storm churning inside him, because all he could see was her face when she said, "I stayed thrown," and it looped in his head like a curse he'd earned and would carry until the day he died. He scoured her file, Lena Moore, degree from NYU, 10 years in design, moved cities 5 years ago, no mention of children, no mention of anything personal, like she'd erased her past completely. And yet, that boy's face in the hospital refused to leave him. Those eyes, those brows, the stubborn tilt of his chin. It wasn't coincidence, it was blood, and something inside Damien roared awake. The instinct of a father he never knew lived inside him, clawing its way through years of cold steel and silent grief, demanding truth, demanding justice. Not just for himself, but for what he may have missed, because suddenly the deal didn't matter. The buildings didn't matter. Not even his legacy mattered if he'd unknowingly left it behind in the arms of a woman he destroyed and never looked back on. So, the next day, he returned to the design firm, this time not as the CEO, not as Damien Blackwood, but as a man quietly chasing ghosts, looking for traces of the life he may have unknowingly abandoned, standing outside her office as he watched her through the glass, her hand sketching a design while she laughed at something her assistant said, her features softer now, peaceful. But even her peace stabbed him, because he wasn't part of it. He waited until her assistant stepped out, knocked once, and when she looked up, their eyes met again, this time with less fire and more ache. And he stepped in slowly, closing the door behind him, his voice barely a whisper. "I need to know, Alina. Please." But she didn't flinch, just leaned back in her chair and said, "Need to know what?" And when he said, "That boy, is he mine?" Her fingers froze midair, her eyes blinked once, and though her lips didn't move, her silence was answer enough. And for the first time in his life, Damien Blackwood felt what it meant to break, not from power, not from loss, but from truth, unfiltered and devastating, wrapped in 5 years of what-ifs and could-have-beens. Damien stood in the hollow silence of his penthouse suite, the echo of Alina's parting words still haunting the air like a ghost refusing to be exorcised. Her scent lingered on his jacket, her voice tangled in his mind like thorns around a bleeding heart. He couldn't sleep, not with the image of that little boy's eyes staring back at him, eyes so eerily familiar they had pierced straight through the armor he'd spent years constructing. Damien Walker had always been a man of logic, of control, a billionaire who dissected problems with surgical precision, but that child, those eyes, those were not things that logic could explain away. They were not coincidence. They were not imagination. They were something deeper, something visceral, something terrifyingly real. So, by the cold gray light of dawn, as the city below stirred to life, Damien reached for his phone with trembling fingers and made a call he never thought he'd make. Not to a friend, not to a family member, but to a man who dealt in secrets for a living. A private investigator named Julian Kane. Discreet, ruthless, precise. Find out everything, Damien whispered over the phone, his voice hoarse from sleeplessness. Her name is Alina Carter. She returned 5 days ago. I want addresses, records, anything and everything. There was a pause on the line before Julian answered in his gravelly, no-nonsense tone. You got it. Give me 72 hours. But Damien couldn't wait 72 hours. Every second was a storm of regret crashing through his chest. He spent the days wandering through the halls of his empire like a ghost, attending board meetings with a blank stare, dismissing presentations without hearing a word, and refusing interviews with the media despite their frenzy about his ex-wife's return. No one knew what churned inside him, except him. And it was hell. The night before Julian's report arrived, Damien stood alone on his balcony, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, staring at the skyline that once made him feel powerful. Now it felt meaningless, hollow. All his achievements, all his wealth, his influence, his control. It couldn't turn back time. It couldn't return what he may have lost. The next morning, an envelope slid under his office door, marked with Julian's insignia. Damien dismissed his assistant and locked the door behind him. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope and unfolded the files. There, staring back at him in clinical black and white printouts, were copies of 3 birth certificates. Not 1, not 2, 3. His breath caught. 3 children, born 5 years ago, each with a different first name but the same surname. Carter. Mother, Alina Carter. Father, listed as unknown. His knees buckled and he dropped into the leather chair behind his desk, his pulse hammering against his throat. 3 children, all the same birth date. Triplets. The thought hit him like a thunderclap. Triplets. Alina had been carrying 3 children when she left him, and he hadn't known. Not even a whisper of a clue. His fingers traced the names. Liam Carter, Liana Carter, and Leora Carter. Names that had never crossed his ears before today, yet now etched themselves into his soul like sacred scripture. He stared at the photos Julian had included, candid shots from a distance. One of a curly-haired boy kicking a ball in a garden, one of a delicate little girl tying her sister's shoelace, one of all 3 huddled together in a blanket fort, peeking out with innocent smiles. And in those faces, God. Damien saw himself, his cheekbones in Liam's face, Alina's dimples in Leora's, his mother's eyes in Liana. A broken, raw sound escaped his throat, a sob or something close to it. He pressed the photos to his chest like they were lifelines, but the guilt clawed at him like fire. 5 years. 5 years of first steps, scraped knees, bedtime stories, first words, belly laughs. 5 years of fatherhood stolen by his own blindness. How had he never asked? How had he let her go without a fight? How had he been so arrogant to believe she had walked away just to wound him? And now she had raised them alone. All 3 of them, triplets. And she had kept them safe, hidden, loved. While he had built a bigger empire, taken more companies, earned more zeros in his bank account, but lost everything that actually mattered. His hands balled into fists around the report as he stood abruptly, sending the chair flying backward. His heart thundered like a war drum, his blood roaring in his ears. He needed to see her. Not tomorrow. Not later. Now. Without telling his assistant or his driver, Damien stormed out of the office, got into his black Aston Martin, and drove himself through the city traffic with white-knuckled desperation. He didn't stop for red lights. He didn't hear the horns. His mind played a cruel loop of all the moments he'd missed. Leora's laughter, Liana's cries, Liam's first word. Would they have called him Daddy? Would they have curled up on his chest after a nightmare? Would he have sung lullabies the way his father used to sing to him? Would he have braided their hair, packed their lunches, taken them to the zoo? When he reached her apartment building, he barely waited for the elevator and took the stairs 2 at a time, his breath ragged with anticipation and fear. When he stood at her door, he hesitated. just 1 second, before knocking. Then again, louder. The door opened, and there she stood. Alina, the woman he had once called wife, the mother of the children he never knew existed. Her expression was unreadable, calm on the surface, but he saw the fire behind her eyes, the storm she fought every day. "You came," she said softly, her voice cool but not cold. "I had to," he breathed. "Alina, I saw the files." Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp. She merely nodded. "Then you know." "Are they mine?" he asked, his voice cracking, falling into a raw, childlike tone he hadn't used in years. "You tell me." Alina stepped aside and motioned him in, her movements slow and deliberate. The apartment was warm, cozy, filled with soft toys, pastel drawings, and the scent of vanilla. The kind of home built by a woman who had poured herself into motherhood. There were shoes by the door, tiny ones, a princess crown on the sofa, a half-finished puzzle on the floor. His knees nearly gave out again. "I should have known," he whispered, staring at a family photo on the shelf. Just her and the kids, taken in the golden light of a park. "You didn't want to." He didn't argue. He forced a smile, as warm and genuine as he could muster, and knelt down slowly to be at their eye level. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion he tried to hide. "I've heard so much about you three." Liam blinked at him, tilting his head. "You know us?" Damien nodded, heart aching. I've wanted to meet you for a long time." "Are you Mommy's friend?" Ariel asked, stepping forward, her fingers still wrapped tightly around her bunny. "Yeah," he whispered. "I'm an old friend. I care about her very much." Noah didn't speak. He simply kept watching, like a puzzle he hadn't decided to solve yet. Alina's hand fell lightly to Noah's shoulder, steadying him. "Why don't you say hi, baby?" she murmured. Noah gave the faintest nod, his expression unreadable, but he didn't run away, and that alone felt like a victory. That evening, Damien didn't press for more. He didn't demand explanations or apologies. He sat on the floor and watched them play, trying to memorize everything. The sound of their laughter, the way Liam always passed the red car to Noah, the way Ariel made up stories and voices for each of her dolls, the way Noah occasionally glanced at him when he thought no one was looking. And Alina. She stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed over her chest, her posture unreadable, her face a fortress of war and love, her eyes darting between him and the children like she didn't know who to protect more. When he finally rose to leave, he turned to her, his voice low. "Thank you for letting me meet them." Her lips were tight. "They don't know who you are. Don't get too comfortable." "I know," he said, "but I'll take whatever you'll give me." And he meant it. Over the next few weeks, Damien became a constant in their lives, but not as their father, not even as someone to be trusted yet, but as a careful, patient presence who never crossed the boundaries Alina laid before him. He showed up at school drop-offs with extra snacks in hand. He sat through kindergarten performances, cheering from the back row as Ariel recited a poem and Noah held up a painting of a giraffe. He bought Liam a soccer ball with his favorite team's logo and joined them at the park on weekends, laughing as he pushed them on swings and raced them across grassy fields. Slowly, inch by inch, they began to accept him. Liam was the first, open, talkative, wild with questions. "Uncle Damien, why don't you have kids? Why are you always alone? Can you come to my birthday?" Damien never knew how to answer some of those questions, but he always showed up. He brought homemade cupcakes and a gift wrapped in superhero paper, and when Liam opened it to find a custom Lego set, he screamed with joy and hugged Damien around the neck. Ariel took longer. She was protective, especially of Alina. But one day when Damien noticed her struggling to braid her hair and offered gently, "I could try, if you want." She hesitated, then nodded. "He had practiced on a doll," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed pain. "I tried to tell you, Damien. I wrote letters. I sent messages. I called. I begged. You were too busy, too angry. You shut every door I knocked on." His heart split open. He remembered those missed calls, the emails he'd deleted, the unopened envelopes, all the signs he had dismissed as her attempts to manipulate him. And now he saw the truth. She hadn't wanted to hurt him. She had wanted to give him the chance to love his children, and he had thrown it all away. I was wrong, he said, voice low, reverent, like a prayer. So wrong, Alina. You never cared to ask when it mattered, she whispered, her hand brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, her face unreadable but wet with unshed tears. Don't pretend to be noble now. I'm not, he said, stepping closer. I'm broken, and it's my fault. But please, let me try. She looked at him for a long moment, eyes swimming with conflicting emotions. Anger, love, fear, regret. They don't know you, she said. They've never even heard your name. I never wanted them to grow up with bitterness. Then let me change that, he pleaded. Let me earn the right to be part of their lives. Silence hung like a fragile thread between them. Then a small voice called from the hallway, Mommy, who's that man? And Damien's heart stopped. Mommy, who's that man? Came the soft, curious voice again, and Damien turned slowly, his chest tightening at the sight of the three children standing just beyond the hallway, small, fragile, breathtakingly beautiful, and so achingly familiar. They stood close together, shoulder to shoulder, like a trio of stars orbiting the same sun, eyes wide with curiosity, innocence, and something he couldn't yet name. The boy who had spoken was Liam. Damien recognized him instantly from Julian's photos, but seeing him in the flesh was something else entirely. He had tousled black hair that curled slightly at the ends, wide hazel eyes too mature for his age, and a cautious tilt to his head, as if studying Damien was an assignment he wanted to get right. Beside him stood Ariel, her thick braid tumbling over one shoulder, eyes shining with a hint of mischief as she clutched a stuffed bunny by the ear, and at the edge of the hallway, half hidden behind the doorframe, was Noah, quieter, solemn, with dark eyes that didn't blink as they stared directly into Damien's soul. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath between heartbeats. Alina moved instinctively, stepping between them like a shield, her voice gentle yet firm as she looked at her children, then at Damien. Kids, this is Uncle Damien, she said after a long pause, and those two words sliced through him like a dull blade. Uncle Damien. Not Dad, not father, not even a hint of the truth. But he understood. This wasn't about him, not yet. This was about the lives she had built from scratch, the safety she had created for them, the boundaries that had protected them from pain. The night before, guided by YouTube videos at 2 a.m., just in case this moment ever came. His hands shook, but he managed a loose but presentable braid. She looked at herself in the mirror and smiled. Not bad for a boy, she said, and he grinned like a man who had just conquered a mountain. Noah, however, was a quiet storm. He didn't speak much, but he watched. He watched Damien's every move, how he helped with the groceries, how he always remembered to remove his shoes before entering the apartment, how he laughed when Alina rolled her eyes at him, how he never tried to hug them unless they initiated it. One rainy afternoon, when Damien brought hot chocolate and a stack of books to read aloud, Noah quietly climbed onto the couch beside him and leaned against his side without a word. Damien didn't move. He just kept reading. And from the kitchen, Alina saw it, her heart lurching in her chest, her fingers curling tightly around a coffee mug as she turned away, hiding tears she refused to let fall. Because, as much as she had sworn to keep him at a distance, there was something she couldn't deny. Her children were happy. They laughed louder, slept better, smiled more. And Damien, he wasn't just showing up. He was present. He was trying. He remembered their favorite colors, their allergies, the bedtime songs Alina hummed on hard nights. He carried Ariel to bed when she fell asleep in the car, wiped Liam's nose during a cold, and bought a second-hand piano just because Noah had once said he liked the sound of it. He became woven into their lives like thread into fabric, not as their father, but as something new, something sacred. And yet, Alina's heart battled itself every single night. She would stand at the doorway while Damien knelt on the living room carpet, helping the kids with a puzzle, his suit jacket tossed aside, his sleeves rolled up, and think, this is what it could have been. A family, a home, a life not built in pain but in promise. And then she would remember the nights she cried alone, swollen with 3 babies in her belly, terrified and abandoned, his silence louder than gunshots. Forgiveness wasn't a door she could simply unlock. It was a fortress he would have to break into one brick at a time. One night, after the children had gone to sleep and Damien was quietly cleaning the kitchen, she stepped in and leaned against the counter. "They're getting attached," she said softly. "I know," he replied without turning. "So am I." Her breath hitched, but she hid it well. "This can't go on forever. One day they'll ask why their uncle doesn't have a family of his own." Damien turned to face her then, his expression bare. "Then I'll tell them the truth, that I made the biggest mistake of my life by not fighting for the people I love, but that I'm here now, not as a savior, but as someone who will never leave again." She stared at him, and in that moment she didn't see the CEO, the empire builder, the cold man who had once walked away. She saw the boy she once loved, the one who used to hum to her belly, the one who kissed her shoulder in the quiet of dawn, the one who once promised forever. And she hated how much she still felt it, that dangerous hope flickering in her chest like a forgotten flame. "Loving a child," she whispered, her voice thick, "is easy. But it's not enough. You have to love the woman who raised them alone." He stepped forward slowly, eyes never leaving hers. "Then let me prove to you. I already do." Silence fell after Damien's last words. "Then let me prove to you. I already do." But it wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken weight, the kind that made the air harder to breathe. Alina didn't respond. She only held his gaze for a moment longer, something stirring in her eyes that he couldn't quite name, something between heartbreak and hesitation, before she turned away without another word. He didn't follow. Not that night. He let her walk away, her silhouette swallowed by the soft hallway light, while he stood alone in the kitchen, fists clenched, jaw tight, a silent scream in his chest. That moment had felt real, too real, and that frightened him more than anything else had in years. But the next morning, Damien was back at school pickup like he always was, dressed more casually now, learning how to fold into this world of lunch boxes and PTA chatter. He leaned against the same tree near the playground gate, hands in his pockets, scanning for the familiar mess of curly hair that belonged to Liam, the bright pink jacket Ariel always wore, or the quiet, thoughtful pace that marked Noah's steps. He had memorized their rhythms now, their tells, their voices. He knew their laughter from 50 feet away. But that day something was different. Before he saw the kids, his eyes found Alina, and she wasn't alone. She stood near the low metal fence that divided the grass from the sidewalk, her head tilted back slightly in laughter, her fingers brushing a stray braid from her cheek as she looked up at a man beside her. The man was tall, kind-eyed, and holding Ariel's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Damien froze, the muscles in his chest coiling into a tight knot, his stomach clenching like a fist. The man bent down to say something to Noah, who nodded with a rare half-smile. Liam joined them next, tugging at the man's sleeve to show him something in his sketchbook. And Alina, she was radiant. Not dressed up, no. But there was a lightness to her he hadn't seen before. The way she touched the man's arm casually, the way she laughed with ease, the way she let her children hover close to him. It was like watching someone else live the life he was trying to rebuild, only they were already in it, comfortably, intimately. He tried to swallow the bitter taste rising in his throat, but it didn't go down. It burned. Damien stepped forward, unable to stop himself. "Hey," he said too sharply. Alina turned, her smile faltering for the briefest second before she nodded in acknowledgement. "Oh, Damien." The other man smiled politely and extended a hand. "You must be Uncle Damien. I've heard your name a lot. I'm Marcus. My daughter is in Ariel's class. We do a lot of the same pickup and drop-off times." Damien shook the offered hand, gripping it a little too tightly. "Nice to meet you," he said flatly, eyes never leaving Alina. "Looks like you're pretty close with the family." Alina narrowed her eyes at him but said nothing. Marcus simply smiled, oblivious. "Yeah, it's been great. Ariel and my daughter are best friends now, and Alina's been amazing with the school project. We've all kind of become a little team lately." The words were innocent, but to Damien they felt like nails. Every syllable etched a wound deeper into his pride. He managed a stiff smile before making a quick excuse and walking off, not waiting to say goodbye. His heart thundered with confusion, pain, and something dangerously close to rage. Not at her, not really, but at himself. At how easily someone else had stepped into the space he thought was slowly becoming his. That night, he couldn't focus on anything. He sat in his darkened penthouse, his phone in his hand, thumb hovering over her number for nearly an hour. His mind played every moment again. Marcus laughing, Ariel holding his hand, Alina glowing beside him, and the way her eyes didn't flicker toward Damien once. He didn't want to care, but he did. Too much. Finally, he gave in. He pressed call. She answered on the second ring. "Hello? Is he your boyfriend?" The question came out rough, venomous, ugly, with emotion he didn't know how to process. Silence. Then a bitter, almost amused breath from her. "Seriously? I just saw the way you looked at him. The way the kids—" "Stop," she cut in, her voice sharp, like a blade finally drawn. "You don't get to ask me that." "Why not?" he snapped, hating the way his voice cracked with jealousy. "Because you lost that right a long time ago," she said coldly. "You don't get to disappear for years and then come back acting like I owe you answers about my personal life. I'm not trying to—" "Yes, you are," she interrupted, and her voice trembled now. But it wasn't weak. It was furious. "You are trying to stake a claim you forfeited the moment you walked away from me. You left me to carry 3 children in silence. You buried yourself in your empire while I was figuring out how to survive one sleepless night at a time. You don't get to be jealous now. You don't get to ask if I've moved on. I had to move on, Damien. Not because I wanted to, because I had to. For them. For me." Her voice cracked then, just slightly, and it gutted him. There was pain beneath her fury. So much of it. "Alina," he whispered, but she was already retreating. "Good night, Damien." The call ended, and he stared at the screen for a long time, blinking hard against the sting in his eyes. He wanted to smash the phone against the wall, throw it across the room, scream into the silence. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring at the reflection of himself in the dark window, wondering how the hell he had become the man who caused all this pain. Days passed, and though he still showed up, still read to the kids, still smiled for them, something in him had shifted. His gaze often strayed to Alina when she wasn't looking, watching how Marcus lingered after events, how he helped her carry backpacks, how he made her laugh with the ease Damien used to have. And it hurt. It hurt like hell. But even in that pain, he saw something clearly for the first time. It wasn't just about being the kid's father anymore. That was sacred, yes. But what unraveled him, what kept him up at night, wasn't just the idea of someone else reading bedtime stories or packing their lunches. It was the thought of someone else holding her at night, of someone else knowing the curve of her body, her sleepy murmurs, her inside jokes, of someone else touching the woman who had once been his entire world. Damien had thought he came back for the kids. But now he knew. He wanted her back. He wanted the woman who had danced barefoot in his living room, who used to run her fingers through his hair while he read her poetry, who carried 3 lives into the world with strength and grace he never deserved. He didn't just want to be their father. He wanted to be her man again. He wanted to kiss away the years he'd stolen from her. He wanted to fight for the family he'd almost lost forever. But first, he'd have to fight himself. Fight the demons that had made him cold, the fear that had kept him silent, the pride that had once made him blind. Because loving her wasn't just a feeling. It would have to be a choice, a commitment, a battle. And this time he'd have to win her with no title, no ring, no promises. Just his heart. Open, raw, real. He didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. Damien sat alone in the living room of his penthouse as the storm outside gathered in thick, thunderous waves, the city lights bleeding through rain-streaked glass, smearing the skyline into a hazy mess. But even that view, the one he once stood before with pride and conquest, meant nothing now. Because his heart wasn't in that room anymore. It was across the city, behind a door he once slammed shut. a door that held behind it the woman he broke and the children he hadn't known he'd die for. The echo of Alina's voice from their last call still scraped at the rawest parts of his soul. You lost the right to ask. I had to move on. And she was right. So painfully, undeniably right. He had built empires with his hands, signed deals with a flick of his pen, bent powerful men to his will, but he had failed the one woman who had only ever wanted his love. That truth gutted him more than any loss in his billion-dollar empire ever could. As the rain began to fall heavier, beating against the windows in a steady rhythm, something inside Damien snapped. Quietly, not with rage, but with heartbreak. He stood slowly, like a man, preparing to walk into battle. But this war wasn't about power. It was about surrender, about laying down every piece of armor he'd ever worn. He didn't grab an umbrella. He didn't change into something warmer. He just grabbed his keys, stepped into the elevator, and let the city's storm baptize him as he drove. It wasn't the road that led him to her door. It was memory. It was regret. It was every single "I love you" he never said. He parked without thinking, walked the blocks to her apartment like he had done it 1,000 times, and by the time he stood at her door, he was soaked to the bone. Water ran down his face, his clothes clung to him like a second skin, and his eyes, oh, his eyes, held the weight of a man completely undone. He didn't knock right away. He just stood there, one hand hovering inches from the wood, heart slamming in his chest like thunder. This door, this very door, was the one he had once closed behind her with a command that still haunted him. Get out. And now he stood on the other side, praying to be let in. He knocked once, twice, softly, reverently, like a man asking for absolution. Inside, Alina stirred. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially not in this weather. But something pulled at her, a strange weight in the air, a heartbeat she couldn't ignore. She opened the door slowly, cautiously, and there he was, Damien, standing in the downpour, shivering, eyes red-rimmed but unflinching. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was rain, falling between them like a veil, soft and cruel. She gasped, instinctively reaching forward. "Damien, what are you doing?" He stepped once into the light, water dripping from his hair, his jacket, his fingertips. "I had to come," he said, voice barely more than a whisper. "I needed you to hear it from me." "You're soaked," she said, stunned. "You'll get sick." "I don't care," he cut in, gently but firmly, and something in her stilled. His voice wasn't cold, it wasn't defensive, it was broken. "I don't care if I freeze out here, I need to tell you the truth." "You already did," she said, trying to close the door slightly, her guard rising. "I don't need more words, Damien. I've had enough of them to last a lifetime." But he didn't let her shut it. He didn't push, just placed his hand on the frame. And then he said the words that finally unraveled the quiet shell between them. "I was scared." She blinked. The rain was falling between them, soaking the carpet by her feet now, but neither of them moved. "What?" she asked, heart in her throat. "That night I yelled at you," he said, chest heaving. "That night I told you to get out. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even about you. It was fear." "Fear of what?" she whispered. "You think you were the only one terrified?" "I was carrying 3 babies alone, Damien. I had no money, no support. I wasn't scared. I was drowning." He nodded, rain sliding from his lashes. "I know. And I wasn't there. And that's on me. But I need you to understand. I lost my mother to betrayal. She lied to my father for years, and when he found out, it destroyed him. And me. I watched love ruin him. And somewhere along the way, I started to believe every woman I loved would lie to me, leave me, ruin me too." "So you thought I was just another woman," Alina said coldly, her voice trembling. "You didn't even give me a chance." "No," he said, stepping forward now, just one small step inside the doorway. "I didn't listen. I judged. I punished you for a crime you never committed. I pushed you out because I was scared you'd leave me first." Her breath caught. He had never said this before, never once admitted what lay beneath his silence, his cruelty, his absence. And now, watching him, soaked, shaking, shattered, something deep in her chest cracked. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something. "Do you know how many nights I cried for you?" she whispered. "Do you know how many times I stood by that crib, holding a baby who needed his father, and wondered if I'd made everything up? If you ever loved me at all?" "I did," he said, voice breaking completely now. "I do. I never stopped. I just... I didn't know how to love without fear. I didn't know how to stay without doubting. But now I'd rather live in fear beside you than in safety without you." She swallowed hard, tears blurring her vision, but she didn't let them fall. Why now? Why after all this time? And then he did something that made the world pause. He dropped to his knees. Right there, in the threshold of her home, in a puddle of rain and regret, Damien Walker, billionaire, feared CEO, master of boardrooms, collapsed to his knees like a sinner at the altar. "Because I need to say it," he choked. "Forgive me, or don't. But no, I never stopped loving you, even when I was too proud to show it, even when I was too blind to see it. I loved you through every deal I signed, every night I drank myself into forgetting. I loved you through every empty room I walked into hoping to see your face. And I love you now, more than I've ever loved anything." She stared at him, her own heart pounding so loud she was sure he could hear it. Her hand gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white, her entire being shaking, not from anger, but from the flood of emotion she had buried for too long. This was the man she once dreamed of marrying, the man who used to kiss her wrist when she couldn't sleep, the man who had once made promises beneath starlight. And for the first time in years, she saw him again, not the CEO, not the ghost of what they were, but him, the Damien she fell in love with, the man who once painted butterflies on her belly when the babies kicked, the man who now kneeled before her, asking not for redemption, but for truth. She reached down, slowly, gently, her fingers brushing his soaked jaw as she whispered, "Get up." His breath caught. He looked up at her, eyes searching. "Alina, I can't promise forgiveness," she said. "Not yet. My heart's still bleeding, Damien. I've learned how to live without you, but I see you tonight. For the first time in a long time, I see you." He stood slowly, his entire body trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of what had just passed between them. The air buzzed with something electric, raw and dangerous and tender all at once. She didn't move as he stood inches from her, didn't flinch, didn't turn away, and neither of them spoke another word. He stepped back, letting the rain wash over him once more, and this time she didn't close the door. She left it ajar, just slightly, enough to let the warmth spill into the storm, enough to let hope slip through the cracks. Alina stood at the doorway that night, her arms wrapped around herself as the last drop of rain trickled down the window pane. Damien had left, soaked and hollow, his apology echoing in every corner of her heart, like a forgotten lullaby. She hadn't responded, not really. She had just watched him fall apart in front of her, like a man unraveling at the seams. But the years she spent raising 3 children alone had taught her that words were never enough. Love wasn't spoken. It was shown, built brick by steady brick, not shattered with one storm, and expected to be whole the next morning. She leaned against the wall and took a shaky breath. That night, the kids were unusually quiet, as if they could sense the emotional weight their mother carried in her eyes. They'd seen the man come, kneel, cry, and leave. Ariel had peeked from the upstairs landing. Liam had stood with his face half hidden behind the curtain. And Noah, as always, had noticed more than he let on, saying nothing but watching everything. Later that evening, the air inside their little home felt charged, not heavy like a storm, but tense like a violin string stretched to its limit. They sat for dinner. The triplets poked at their food, barely speaking, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound filling the space. Then Liam, always the one with the biggest heart, finally looked up, his brown eyes mirroring something deeper than a child's curiosity. "Mom," he said softly, and Alina, mid-bite, looked at him, startled by the tremor in his voice. "That man." Liam hesitated, his fingers curling around the edge of the table. The one who was crying at the door. Is he our dad? The silence that followed was like a glass shattering in slow motion. Ariel's fork slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor with a metallic ring. Noah's chair creaked as he leaned back, staring at Alina with an expression unreadable, cold, perhaps, but not cruel. Alina froze, her chest constricting. She hadn't planned this. She had rehearsed so many scenarios, but none began like this, with rain, a doorstep, and a question that carried 5 years of silence. She placed her fork down gently, folding her hands on the table like she did during hard talks. Her voice trembled, but she didn't want to lie. Not anymore. Yes, she said, and the word broke something in the air. His name is Damien. He's your father. Ariel burst into tears immediately, pushing her chair back and running to her room, her sobs muffled behind her bedroom door. Liam blinked, stunned, then looked down at his plate like he couldn't process the truth. Noah stood, but unlike his siblings, he said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, his face hard like marble, leaving behind a silence that screamed. Alina wanted to reach for them, to hold them all at once, to apologize for hiding the truth, for choosing silence when they deserved answers, but motherhood was a constant battle between protection and honesty, and tonight she felt like she'd failed both. Later that night, when the house grew quiet and the lights dimmed, Damien sat in his car parked just down the block. He hadn't gone far. He couldn't. He had waited like a coward for something. Anything. He didn't know if he'd hear a door open or see one of them walk out to find him. But the street remained empty, silent but for the occasional drip of water from the rooftops. He held his phone, staring at it like it might burn him. And then it lit up. A message from Alina. Just one word. They know. His hands trembled. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified, but the next morning, despite the fear tightening his chest, Damien showed up at their door again, this time with a bag full of their favorite snacks, 3 new storybooks, and a heart so open it ached. Alina let him in with a nod, no words exchanged. He entered quietly and saw Liam sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around him like armor. Ariel peeked from behind the hallway wall, her red eyes wary but curious. Noah sat at the dining table, sketching something, as if nothing in the world had changed, even though everything had. Damien knelt beside Liam first, not touching, just sitting. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice breaking again. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you were sick or scared or happy. I'm sorry I missed your first day of school and your birthdays and your first scraped knee. I can never get those years back, and I will never forgive myself for that. But I'm here now, and if you let me, I'll stay." Liam stared at him for a long moment, lips pressed together, and then, without a word, handed him the remote. It was a small gesture, but one that made Damien's throat close. Next came Ariel. She didn't cry this time. She just stared, clutching her favorite doll, eyes darting between her mom and the man she now knew was her father. Damien didn't rush her. He simply handed her a small hairbrush, the same kind he had used to learn how to braid, just so he could do her hair right. "You don't have to forgive me," he said, "but I'd like to learn how to do your braids again. Maybe you can teach me this time?" Her lips trembled, and she nodded slightly before whispering, "Only if you stop making them so lumpy." He laughed through a choked sob, nodding like it was a sacred promise. Noah, however, was the hardest. Damien walked to him last. The boy didn't look up, kept sketching, pencil dancing across paper like a weapon of expression. Damien sat across from him, hands clasped. "I don't expect you to say anything. You're the quiet one, huh?" Noah finally looked up, his eyes sharp, older than his age. "Why didn't you come before?" he asked, and the question hit Damien like a punch. "Because I didn't know," Damien said truthfully, "and even when I found out, I was scared I didn't deserve you." Noah stared at him a beat longer, then slid the drawing across the table. It was a sketch of a man standing in the rain, his head bowed, with 3 small figures watching from a window. "That was you last night," Noah said quietly. "I watched." Damien's eyes filled again, and he nodded, taking the paper like it was the most precious gift in the world. In the weeks that followed, things weren't perfect, but they were better. Damien showed up at every school game, every recital. He brought cupcakes to Ariel's class. He helped Liam build a birdhouse for science fair. He and Noah started painting murals together on the backyard fence. Alina watched, cautious but softening. She still remembered the years of silence, the pain of being abandoned, the weight of raising 3 children alone. But now, seeing Damien finally show up, finally try, something inside her shifted. One night, as she stood at the kitchen window watching Damien chase the kids around the garden with a water hose, their laughter filling the night, she found herself smiling without realizing it. He was earning his place, not just with the kids, but with her heart again. One evening, Liam fell and scraped his knee badly. It wasn't anything serious, but the moment he cried out, Damien rushed to him faster than anyone, scooping him up and sitting with him on the porch steps. "You're brave," he whispered, cleaning the wound gently. "But even the bravest boys need someone to patch them up." Liam didn't flinch. He just nodded, clutching his dad's hand tight. Ariel watched, her eyes wide, before crawling into Damien's lap too. "Can you read us the new story tonight?" she asked. "The one with the dragon who misses his family." Damien smiled. "Only if you do the dragon voice this time." Even Noah, pretending not to care, lingered a little closer that night. Later, as the kids fell asleep and the house quieted, Alina stood outside on the porch. Damien joined her, standing a careful distance away. "Thank you," he said softly. She turned to him. "For what?" He looked at her like she was the only light he had left. "For letting me try." Her eyes stayed steady, and though she didn't speak, something unspoken passed between them. A thread mending after being torn. The wounds weren't gone. The past still lived between them. But now, for the first time, so did hope. Alina stood in the kitchen late that evening, her arms wrapped around herself as the faint hum of the dishwasher buzzed in the background, the triplets already tucked. In bed after another day filled with cautious smiles, nervous questions, and the slow, aching dance of healing that none of them quite knew how to perform, but were learning together. The quiet moments haunted her the most, when her hands weren't full of juice spills or wiping away tiny tears, when her eyes weren't forced to stay sharp and strong for the 3 pieces of her soul that looked up to her like she held the world together. That's when her heart wandered most, back to the man who used to be her world, the man who shattered her with silence and suspicion, the man who was now, against all odds, kneeling beside their children's scraped knees, brushing hair into pigtails with trembling fingers, and showing up like time had not robbed them of 5 impossible years. And tonight, something in her chest was restless, something humming too loudly to ignore, a tug she hadn't felt in years. She stepped into the backyard to breathe, only to freeze, because fairy lights danced like fireflies around her garden, twinkling against the dusk in patterns so soft and familiar it stole her breath. A small wooden sign was planted at the edge of the grass, painted by tiny hands and childish scrawls. "Follow the sparkle, Mama." And she did, barefoot on the grass, still wet with dew, her heart thudding in her throat. She turned the corner past the rose bushes and stopped. There he was, Damien, in a navy blue suit that fit like second skin, his eyes reflecting every apology he'd ever whispered since the night he came back in the rain. And standing beside him were Liam, Ariel, and Noah, each wearing matching white shirts with glittery letters. Liam spelled Will, Ariel's top spelled You, and Noah's shirt, slightly crooked, spelled Marry Us. Her breath caught. She looked at them and her heart splintered and stitched itself all at once. Liam held a tiny velvet box. Damien's hands trembled as he took it, stepping forward with a kind of fear that only love could create. The fear of being seen, truly seen, and still not being enough. "Alina," he began, voice husky, raw and careful, like every syllable might break the fragile hope hanging in the air. "I know I don't deserve a second chance. I know I missed too much, hurt too deeply. But I also know I have never stopped loving you. And these 3, our 3, taught me what it means to love unselfishly, to give without needing to own. You raised them into magic. You carried them alone, but not anymore. I don't just want to be their father. I want to be your partner, your peace, your arms at the end of every long day. I want to love the woman who carried the weight of the world when I dropped it. He knelt slowly, as if each motion was an offering, not just a proposal. He opened the box. Inside were 3 tiny rings, each engraved with one child's name, and in the center a dazzling, modest ring that held no diamonds, but shimmered with a small blue sapphire, the same shade as the dress she wore on their first date, the night he first fell for her. "Will you marry me?" he whispered. "Not just for the kids, but for you, for us, for the home we never got to build the first time." The triplets watched, holding their breath, wide-eyed. Liam nodded seriously, like he was giving permission. Ariel sniffled and wiped her tears with the back of her hand, whispering, "Please say yes, Mama." Even Noah, always quiet, always careful, gave a small smile that made Alina's knees weaken. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears spilled over. She stared at the man she once loved with everything, the man who'd become a stranger, and now, slowly, achingly, was becoming hers again, not because he begged, but because he changed. She took a trembling step forward, her fingers brushing the velvet box, before lifting his chin with one hand. "You broke me," she whispered, her voice hoarse with every unshed tear. "But you rebuilt yourself. For them. And for me. You came back, not with excuses, but with proof. You earned every step it took to get here tonight." He swallowed hard, his jaw quivering. Her eyes, filled with memories and hope, locked onto his. "Yes," she said, so softly it was a breath. "Yes, Damien." For a second there was silence. Then the garden exploded with tiny cheers as the triplets clapped, jumped, and screamed, "We're a family!" Damien stood, barely able to see through the tears, as he slipped the ring onto her finger, the kids wrapping around their legs in a group hug that smelled like strawberries, Play-Doh, and second chances. Alina kissed the top of each child's head, then looked up at Damien. "No more walking away," she said. "Ever." He nodded, pulling them all in, his arms full of the life he almost lost and the love he fought to reclaim. The stars shimmered above them, the fairy lights swayed in the breeze, and for the first time in years, Alina didn't feel like a warrior standing alone. She felt like a woman loved by the father of her children, by the man who once failed her but now stood beside her, stronger than before. And as their children laughed beneath the night sky, spinning in the glow of new beginnings, she knew this was not just an ending. It was the beautiful, long-awaited start of a forever they all deserved.